Anthony Dessau's debut novel, Kicking the Sky, the follow-up to his Giller shortlisted short story collection, Barnacle Love, was always going to speak to me as a reader because I came of age in a town in which two young women were tortured, then murdered, before the general public knew the names Paul Bernardo and Carla Homolka. In Kicking the Sky, Dessau harkens back to the 1977 sexual torture and murder of a Yonge Street shoeshine boy, Emanuel Jaques. It's a coming-of-age tale told through the eyes of 12-year-old Antonio, as well as a meditation on Toronto the Good's loss of innocence, particularly among the Portuguese community. I spoke with Anthony Dessau via Skype about dark places, revisiting the past, and the surprising opportunity to discuss liberation against the backdrop of tragedy. We begin with Anthony's own memories of 1977 and how Emanuel Jaques' death was discussed around his home.
Let's begin with that last part. It wasn't discussed around my home. And I think that's probably one of the differences between parenting nowadays and how things were back then. But coming from a Portuguese household, we didn't talk about these things. That was relegated to the world of adults. Adults could talk about it, but children had no right to engage in that kind of discussion. I think they were discussing what was happening, but I think so much of what they were discussing was real conjecture. I mean, they didn't have a lot of the facts, and it was such a tightly knit community that a great deal of that information became, broken telephone, and things changed drastically. And I remember that if it ever did get to us, the kids, it had changed or morphed into something that actually wasn't true. And so the death of the murder of Emanuel Jaques became more fiction than anything else.
Let's talk a little bit about that then, because while this is your first novel, you've said in a number of places that you feel as if you've been writing this story since you were 11 years old. And of course, Shoeshine Boy was a short story in Barnacle Love. So I'm curious to know what made you revisit this in novel form and why you chose to narrate it through the gaze of a 12-year-old boy.
I loved that story. It was such a pivotal story. I was surprised it hadn't been dealt with in terms of literature. It was such a kind of watershed moment for this city and for a community. And I thought it would be, I was now emboldened by the success of Barnacle Love that I felt I could take this on. And I know how adults feel about child murder. I know how we see the world because we have lived so much. But I wanted to really capture that kind of child sense of wonderment and magic and sense of invincibility, even in this incredibly dark world, as you rightly pointed out at the beginning of the interview. The Emanuel Jaques case in the novel really becomes the backdrop for the real story, which is the story of these three boys living in the community at the time, and how it affected their lives, and how in many respects it changed the way they saw the world. I kind of allowed the boys to wander off, to get onto their bikes and to peer in places thought safe from prying eyes. But, they go places that they probably shouldn't go, or very dangerous, and they still do it with that kind of sense of wonderment that only a 12-year-old can have. Because they're not going to be denied their childhoods. They're on that cusp of, wanting to be kids, but also wanting to tamper with what it is to be an adult.
There's some very notable things around sexuality, burgeoning sexuality.
Sure. Sexuality is a big part of this book, and that was also a really fascinating place to go. My contention is that what Antonio is feeling in terms of his sexual struggle, his internal understanding of who he is something that I would say a majority of boys feel. And I just think it's one of those things where men don't want to talk about it. Yeah, and so some of the boys get into some crazy things. Ricky is giving blowjobs for a few bucks in the laneway, and Maddie gets involved with theft, and at some point starts delivering drugs, and James is pimping Ricky out, and Antonio is having these conflicting feelings about his sexuality and who he is drawn to. Mm-hmm. It was quite wonderful as a writer to explore those worlds in the minds of these 12-year-old characters.
Well, I also found it fascinating as a reader because with the Emanuel Jaques backstory, here's a situation where this boy has so clearly been a victim of someone else's sexual depravity. And yet the flip side of that is you've got these other boys who are actually really trying to discover sexual agency.
You know what? It's an incredible observation. You're so dead on. I mean, this was a tumultuous time, not just because of the murder of this boy by pedophiles. And let's make this clear, that these men were pedophiles. The media was quick to jump on these men and brand them homosexuals. They were deviants. And remember, I think it's really important to place the kind of political time that we were in. So, for example, the gay and lesbian community in Toronto was just becoming more visible in the city. There was a certain kind of pride that was coming with that. And even a week before Emanuel Jaques' murder, the Ontario Human Rights Commission had released a report recommending, the inclusion of sexual orientation as a prohibited ground for discrimination. Only a week before. And this was already causing a great deal of controversy in the media. So the Emanuel Jaques murder at the hands of these pedophiles was somehow morphed into the murder of a boy at the hands of homosexuals, which just added more vitriolic fluid to the fire. Because the truth is, Toronto the Good, or that moniker Toronto the Good, really wasn't. I mean, Toronto wasn't the good. Yonge Street was a seedy strip, an underbelly of a prostitution and pornographic bookstores and videos and massage parlors. I mean, there was a lot of stuff going on. And people needed an excuse to clean it up. It was so timely that the Emanuel Jaques murder happened when it did. What makes this even more exaggerated is that you're dealing with a community, a Portuguese community, and I'm part of that community, or was part of that community, that doesn't have a great tolerance for inclusivity. So it became a real kind of political maelstrom, and it was used profusely by media, by communities, by politicians, by the police force, to attempt to kind of deal with the issue of sexuality in the city. And I remember that door of my house being locked for the first time. Everything seemed to be kind of secretive in an already very cloistered kind of community.
I'm thinking now again about the fact that you are a father to 3 teenage boys. Do you find yourself waking up in the morning and sitting them down and reading them passages from Kicking the Sky?
No, but it should be interesting to see what their reaction will be to my writing, because I kind of get wrapped up in that dark world. I find it very seductive and kind of intimate. But I like to think that also this book at the end, really, there's a kind of light that comes through, that there is a hope for these boys, that life is okay, and we all go through a kind of shit and deal with it. And I think that's the difference today. Back then, we were allowed to scrape our knees and get banged up and go places on our own. And it's a very different world, even though statistically we know that Toronto was probably safer than it was in 1977. Yet we drive our kids everywhere, we bubble wrap them and helicopter parent them, and, it's unbelievable that my boys come home and scream out, "What do we have to eat?" without even opening up the fridge door. I remember growing up and, we just fended for ourselves. Our parents weren't home. We were latchkey kids. Mm-hmm. They worked very hard. They were absent and maybe neglectful, if you want to call it that. But we became resilient adults as a result.
I think a little benign neglect is really good when it comes to teenagers.
I'm with you on that one.
Emanuel Jaques' murder wasn't that long ago that 2 of the 3 men who were arrested are still alive and in jail. Have you imagined a copy of your book landing in those jail cells?
Julie, it's so funny. I just came back from taping with Steve Paikin and TV Ontario, and the same question came up. Pointedly, I said I wouldn't be surprised if at least one of them, Saul Batech, the main guy, who is on one of those American sites for pen pals, for prison inmate pen pals, and he's now a Wiccan. I wouldn't be surprised if he tries to contact me in some way. And I am very concerned about my children. But again, I think that because I've been true to the facts of that murder, and I'm not dealing with the Emanuel Jaques murder per se, I don't think that there would be much concern that I hadn't got it right.
Interesting, because I was wondering if it would be more a desire to want to communicate with someone who had spent that much time thinking about the deed itself, I suppose, like a manufactured intimacy or something.
Okay, now you're going to a much darker place.
See?
Right?
Okay, good.
And now you're really freaking me out. But, one of the things with this book, and I got to say, is that I love going to these dark places. I won't even tell you what my next book's about. I described it to someone, and it was horror in their faces. But the idea was that in the midst of all of this adult angst that we as adults reading the book will see and will be invited and drawn into this very dark world, that there is still a kind of lightness. And I don't want to say that boys will be boys, but that there is this really magical quality about these characters, that something so awful can happen, and within 5 or 10 minutes, they can not completely tune it out, but they can get on their banana seat bike and ride through the laneways and skip and fly over rooftops and joke about farts and just be who they want to be still. Because that would be terrible if we were completely robbed of that.
Our thanks to Anthony Dessault for speaking to us from his home. Kicking the Sky is published by Doubleday Canada. This has been a 49th Shelf podcast, and I'm Julie Wilson. Take care.